Imagine standing in one of the holiest places on earth, surrounded by cardinals, bishops, and nobility, attending the funeral of God's representative on earth. Now imagine that corpse suddenly exploding in front of you, showering everyone with putrid flesh and bodily fluids. This isn't fiction. This is one of the most horrifying moments in papal history, and today we're going to explore every grotesque detail of how a pope's body became a ticking time bomb that detonated during his own funeral service. The medieval period was filled with death, disease, and religious fervor, but even by those standards, what happened to this particular pontiff stands out as uniquely horrifying. This is a story about the intersection of disease, decay, and the desperate attempts to maintain dignity in death when the human body has other plans. Before we dive into the explosion itself, we need to understand the world that made such a nightmare possible. The Roman Catholic Church in the medieval era wielded immense power across Europe. Popes were not merely spiritual leaders, but political power brokers who commanded armies, influenced kings, and shaped the destiny of nations. When a pope died, it was a momentous occasion that required elaborate ceremonies, prolonged mourning periods, and careful orchestration of succession. The funeral of a pope was meant to demonstrate the eternal nature of the Church and the seamless transition of divine authority. What nobody anticipated was that human biology would rebel against religious protocol in the most spectacular and disgusting way imaginable. Death in medieval times was a constant companion, but the death of a pope presented unique challenges. These men often died in the height of summer, when Rome's heat could be absolutely merciless. Without modern embalming techniques or refrigeration, preservation of bodies was rudimentary at best. The standard practice involved washing the corpse, stuffing body cavities with herbs and aromatic substances, and wrapping the body in fine linens and vestments. For a pope, this process was even more elaborate, as his body would need to lie in state for days, while dignitaries from across Christendom made their way to Rome to pay respects. The particular pontiff at the center of our story had been ravaged by disease during his final days. Historical accounts, though sometimes conflated between different popes due to incomplete records, describe a man whose body began failing him in the most horrific ways while he still drew breath. His flesh began to blacken and emit a smell so foul that attendants could barely stand to be in his presence. Some sources suggest he suffered from a combination of gangrene and what we might today recognize as necrotizing fasciitis, a flesh-eating bacterial infection that causes tissue to die and decompose even before death occurs. The Pope's physicians, limited by medieval medical knowledge, could do nothing but watch as their patient literally rotted alive. They applied poultices of herbs, performed bloodletting, and prayed fervently, but the disease progressed with horrifying speed. The blackened flesh spread from his extremities toward his core, and the stench of decay filled the papal apartments. Servants were assigned in rotating shifts because the smell was so overwhelming that they would become nauseated and faint. Chronicles describe how the dying pope was aware of his own decomposition, a psychological horror compounding his physical agony. When death finally came, it must have seemed like a mercy to both the Pope and those attending him. But death was merely the beginning of a new nightmare. The church bureaucracy immediately swung into action, preparing for the elaborate funeral rites that would befit a successor of St. Peter. Messages were sent across Europe announcing the Pope's passing and summoning church officials to Rome. Meanwhile, the body needed to be prepared for viewing and burial, a task that would prove far more challenging than anyone anticipated. The embalmers who approached the papal corpse faced an unprecedented situation. The body was already in an advanced state of decomposition, despite the man having only just died. The skin was mottled black and green, with areas that had begun to slough off. The smell was beyond anything they had encountered in their professional careers, a combination of putrefaction, infected tissue, and the underlying sweetness of rot that would become all too familiar in the coming days. Nevertheless, their duty was clear. They had to make this corpse presentable for one of the most important funerals the Christian world would witness. The disease that consumed him. To understand the catastrophic failure that occurred at the funeral, we must first comprehend the nature of the disease that ravaged this pope's body. Medieval medical texts describe various afflictions that could cause living flesh to rot, though their understanding of these conditions was filtered through religious and supernatural explanations rather than germ theory. What they called divine punishment or demonic possession we now recognize as aggressive bacterial infections, gangrenous conditions, and diseases that cause tissue necrosis. The most likely culprit, based on historical descriptions, was a combination of necrotizing fasciitis and gas gangrene. Necrotizing fasciitis is a rapidly spreading bacterial infection that destroys skin, muscle, and underlying tissues. It's often caused by Streptococcus pyogenes or other bacteria that produce toxins, killing tissue faster than the body can respond. Gas gangrene, typically caused by Clostridium perfringens bacteria, produces gas as a byproduct of its metabolism, causing tissues to swell and creating a distinctive crackling sensation when touched. Both conditions can spread with terrifying speed and are often fatal even with modern antibiotics. The Pope's initial symptoms likely began with what seemed like a minor wound or skin irritation. Perhaps it was a small cut that became infected, or an insect bite that introduced bacteria beneath the skin. In the unsanitary conditions of medieval Rome, where basic hygiene was poorly understood and washing was often avoided for religious reasons, such minor injuries could quickly become life-threatening. Within hours or days of infection, the skin around the wound would have become red, swollen, and intensely painful. The Pope might have dismissed these early symptoms as insignificant, continuing with his duties while the infection took hold. As the bacteria multiplied, they began releasing toxins that killed surrounding tissue. The affected area would have turned dark purple, then black as the flesh died. The infection spread along fascial planes, the layers of tissue that separate muscles, allowing it to advance rapidly through the body. Medieval observers described how the darkness seemed to creep up his limbs like a shadow, swallowing healthy flesh as it progressed. The dying tissue became a breeding ground for more bacteria, accelerating the decay process and releasing foul-smelling gases. The pain must have been excruciating. Necrotizing fasciitis causes intense, constant pain that far exceeds what the visible injury would suggest. The Pope would have been unable to sleep, barely able to think clearly, as his nervous system screamed warnings that something was catastrophically wrong. His physicians administered what pain relief they could, likely tinctures of opium or other plant-based analgesics. But these would have been woefully inadequate against the agony he experienced. Some accounts suggest he begged for death, crying out to God for release from his suffering. As the infection progressed into its later stages, the Pope's body began producing massive amounts of gas. The bacteria causing gas gangrene metabolize tissue and produce hydrogen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen as byproducts. These gases became trapped in tissue spaces, causing the affected areas to swell grotesquely and make a crackling sound called crepitus when pressed. His limbs and torso began to balloon with trapped gas, stretching his skin to a grotesque translucence. Attendants reported that touching the dying Pope's flesh felt like pressing bubble wrap, with gas pockets shifting and popping beneath the surface. The combination of rotting tissue and gas production created an apocalyptic smell. Those who had to tend to the Pope wrapped cloths soaked in vinegar or perfumed oils around their faces, but nothing could completely block the stench. It was described as a mixture of rotten meat, sewage, and something sweet and cloying that seemed to coat the inside of one's nose and throat. Visitors to the papal chambers would often vomit upon entering, and some refused to approach the dying pontiff despite their religious duty to do so. The smell permeated the entire section of the papal residence, clinging to clothing and hair, impossible to wash away. In his final days, the Pope's body began leaking fluids from the necrotic tissue. Dark, foul-smelling discharge oozed from the blackened areas, staining his bedclothes and pooling beneath him. His attendants had to change his linens constantly, burning the soiled materials because the smell was so persistent. Despite their efforts, the Pope spent his final hours lying in his own putrefaction, fully aware of what was happening to him. Chronicles suggest he prayed constantly, not for healing, but for his soul, believing that this horrific death was either divine punishment for his sins or a test of his faith. Death and the impossible task. When the Pope finally succumbed to his afflictions, death came not as a peaceful release, but as a transition from one nightmare to another. His last breath was reportedly accompanied by a wet, gurgling sound as fluid-filled lungs failed to draw air. His eyes, which had been sunken and glazed for days, stared blankly upward. The attendants who had maintained vigil quickly moved to begin the traditional death rites, but they immediately encountered problems that no papal death had presented before. The body was not just dead, it was already in advanced decomposition, having begun rotting before life had fully departed. The task of preparing a papal corpse for funeral rites fell to a special group of attendants who combined religious duties with practical mortuary work. These men had handled many dead bodies throughout their careers, but nothing had prepared them for what they now faced. When they approached the bed where the Pope had died, the smell intensified to such a degree that several attendants fled the room retching. Those who remained had to work in short shifts, rushing outside every few minutes to gulp fresh air before returning to their grim task. The first step in traditional papal death preparations involved washing the body with wine and water, a ritual meant to purify the deceased pontiff. But when the attendants began this process, they discovered that the Pope's skin was sloughing off in sheets. Areas of blackened tissue came away at the slightest touch, revealing the liquefying muscle and fat beneath. The wine and water they used for washing turned immediately dark and cloudy, contaminated by the products of decomposition. The attendants realized they could not complete a thorough washing without literally stripping the flesh from the bones, so they did what they could, gently dabbing at areas that remained somewhat intact. Dressing the body in papal vestments proved nearly impossible. The corpse was bloated with gas, making it difficult to maneuver into clothing. Arms and legs that should have been stiff with rigor mortis instead felt like overfilled bladders that might burst at any moment. When they tried to raise the body to slip vestments underneath, gas escaped from various orifices with sounds that horrified the attendants. The smell that accompanied these gaseous releases was so intense that it caused immediate vomiting. Several attendants claimed they could taste the death smell in their mouths for days afterward, no matter how much wine they drank or herbs they chewed. The tradition called for the Pope's body to be displayed in state, allowing clergy and dignitaries to pay their respects before burial. This meant the corpse would need to remain viewable for several days, perhaps even a week, as important figures traveled to Rome. The embalmers knew that in the summer heat, even a healthy corpse would begin to decompose rapidly. With a body that was already rotting, they faced an impossible task. Nevertheless, they set to work with the tools and techniques available to them, hoping that divine intervention might slow the inevitable decay. Medieval embalming techniques were crude by modern standards, but relatively effective for normal circumstances. The process typically involved removing internal organs, which decomposed fastest, then packing body cavities with aromatic substances like myrrh, frankincense, cinnamon, and salt. The body would be washed with wine or alcohol, which had some antibacterial properties, then wrapped in linens treated with oils and resins. For a pope, additional measures included coating the face and hands with beeswax to preserve their appearance, and stuffing the mouth and nose with herb-soaked cloth. But when the embalmers tried to remove the Pope's organs, they encountered a grotesque situation. The internal organs had already begun to liquefy. The intestines, which normally would have been carefully extracted through an abdominal incision, instead poured out as a soup-like substance mixed with gas and putrid fluid. The liver and spleen, which should have been solid organs, had the consistency of pudding. The embalmers worked as quickly as possible, trying not to breathe, trying not to think about the fact that they were elbow deep in the liquefied remains of God's representative on earth. After removing what they could of the internal organs, the embalmers packed the body cavity with enormous amounts of aromatic herbs, salt, and sawdust, hoping to absorb the internal fluids and control the smell. They used nearly their entire supply of frankincense and myrrh, expensive materials normally used sparingly. They stuffed so much material into the corpse that they had to work to close the abdominal incision, the body so full of packing material that it seemed ready to burst. They then wrapped the entire torso in multiple layers of linen, creating what they hoped would be a sufficient barrier against the continuing decomposition. The face presented a special challenge because it would remain visible during the lying-in state. The Pope's facial features had been distorted by swelling, his skin mottled with dark patches and areas where tissue had begun to separate. The embalmers applied thick coats of beeswax mixed with oils and pigments, essentially creating a mask over the decomposing face beneath. They positioned the ceremonial papal mitre carefully to hide the most damaged areas of the scalp, where hair had begun falling out in clumps. They arranged the hands in prayer position, crossing them over the chest, and covered them with jeweled gloves that hid the blackened, swollen fingers. The lying-in state, the prepared body was moved to the papal basilica, where it would lie in state upon a magnificent catafalque. The catafalque was a raised platform draped in rich fabrics and surrounded by hundreds of candles. The symbolism was powerful. The Pope elevated above mortal concerns, surrounded by light, waiting for his soul's ascent to heaven. But beneath the religious symbolism and elaborate decoration, there was a corpse that was continuing to decompose despite every effort to preserve it. The embalmers had done their best, but they knew they were fighting a losing battle against biology. The decision to proceed with the traditional lying-in-state period was controversial, even among the cardinals. Some argued that the Pope should be buried immediately, given the condition of his body. Others insisted that tradition must be maintained, that abandoning the proper funeral rites would be seen as disrespectful to the deceased pontiff and could undermine confidence in the Church during a vulnerable time of transition. The factions supporting immediate burial pointed to the obvious health risks and the potential for scandal if the body's condition became obvious to visitors. Those favoring tradition countered that any departure from established protocol would fuel rumors and speculation that might be even more damaging. In the end, tradition won. The papal body was placed in the basilica, and word was sent throughout Rome that clergy and faithful citizens could come to pay their respects. What followed over the next several days was a parade of people who would leave with stories they would never forget, and in some cases could never speak about. The vast basilica, even with its high ceilings and open doors, could not dispel the smell that emanated from the catafalque. Attendants burned enormous amounts of incense, creating clouds of sweet smoke that were supposed to mask the odor of death, but instead created a sickly combination that many found even worse than the smell of decomposition alone. The clergy who maintained vigil around the corpse worked in short shifts. Standing near the body for more than a few minutes became unbearable as the smell intensified over the days. Some monks and priests who volunteered for the honor of keeping watch beside their departed spiritual father found themselves unable to complete their assigned time, fleeing to vomit in the side chapels before returning to their posts. Despite drinking wine and chewing mint leaves, they could not escape the taste of death that seemed to coat their mouths and throats. Several suffered nightmares for years afterward, dreaming of the swollen, wax-covered face of the dead Pope staring at them from the shadows. Visitors who came to pay respects encountered a scene that challenged their faith and their stomachs. The approach to the catafalque required walking up a long aisle, giving the smell plenty of time to intensify as they drew closer. Many pilgrims and dignitaries who had traveled for days to honor the Pope found themselves unable to approach the body. They would stop halfway down the aisle, overcome by nausea, and retreat. Some collapsed. Others made it to the catafalque, knelt briefly in prayer, and hurried away as quickly as decorum allowed. Despite the wax coating and elaborate vestments, it was obvious to anyone who looked closely that the body beneath was in a state of advanced decay. As the days passed, the condition of the corpse deteriorated visibly. The wax coating on the face began to crack as the tissues beneath continued to swell and shift. Dark fluid began seeping through the multiple layers of wrapping around the torso, creating spreading stains on the fine vestments. The hands, despite being covered with gloves, swelled to grotesque proportions, the fingers looking more like sausages than human digits. The embalmers rushed to apply fresh wax coatings and rearrange the vestments to hide the worst of the damage, but they were fighting entropy itself and losing badly. The heat was the final, crucial factor in this unfolding disaster. Rome in summer could be brutally hot, with temperatures inside the basilica reaching levels that would be uncomfortable for the living and catastrophic for a decomposing corpse. The thick stone walls that normally kept the interior cool seemed to trap heat instead, creating an environment like an oven. The hundreds of candles burning around the catafalque added their own heat, further accelerating the breakdown of tissue. Inside the papal corpse, bacteria that had been established during his illness continued their work, multiplying exponentially, producing more gas, breaking down more tissue, creating a pressure that built steadily toward a catastrophic release. By the third day of lying in state, some of the more observant clergy noticed ominous signs. The corpse appeared to be swelling even more than before, the abdomen rising beneath the vestments, as if the dead pope was taking a deep breath. Occasionally, there would be soft sounds from the body, like distant thunder or a creaking door, as gas shifted inside the sealed cavity. The embalmers were summoned repeatedly to address new leaks of fluid and to reinforce the wrappings, but they were running out of materials and ideas. In hushed conversations, they began to express concerns about what might happen if the pressure inside the corpse found a way to escape suddenly. Their warnings were dismissed as overreaction by senior clergy who were committed to seeing the traditional funeral rites through to completion. The final day of lying in state arrived, and preparations began for the funeral mass that would be held the following morning. The basilica would be packed with the most important religious and secular figures in Christendom. Dignitaries had arrived from across Europe, and the ceremony would be a display of the Church's power and the continuity of papal authority. The liturgy had been carefully planned, the processions choreographed, and the music rehearsed. Everything was ready for a solemn and magnificent send-off for the deceased pontiff. What nobody had planned for was the starring role that decomposition and physics were about to play in the proceedings. The funeral procession begins. The morning of the funeral dawned hot and still, with barely a breath of wind to provide relief from the oppressive Roman heat. As the sun rose, temperatures began climbing toward what would be one of the hottest days of the year. Inside the basilica, despite the early hour, the air was already thick and stifling. The stone walls that had absorbed heat during the previous days now radiated it back, turning the interior into an oven. The hundreds of candles that had burned continuously during the lying in state added their warmth, and now hundreds more were lit for the funeral ceremony. The perfect conditions for disaster had assembled. Bishops, cardinals, abbots, and representatives from royal houses across Europe filed into the basilica in their formal vestments. The layers of heavy fabric, the elaborate headpieces, and the ceremonial regalia made the heat even more unbearable. Before the ceremony had even begun, several elderly prelates had to be assisted to seats, overcome by the combination of heat and the pervasive smell that no amount of incense could mask. Pages carried folding fans and jugs of water, moving through the assembly, trying to provide what small relief they could. Despite the discomfort, the assembled dignitaries maintained their composure. They had endured worse for the sake of duty and faith. The papal corpse remained on its catafalque at the center of the basilica, surrounded by even more flowers and incense burners than had been present during the lying-in state. The smell, if anything, had grown worse overnight, despite the embalmer's final attempts at preservation. The wax coating on the face had cracked extensively, and the features beneath were barely recognizable as human. The body was noticeably more swollen than it had been the previous evening. The abdomen distended to such a degree that the vestments stretched tight across it. To those with knowledge of death and decomposition, the corpse looked like a bomb waiting to explode, but the ceremony had to proceed according to tradition. The funeral mass began with a procession of clergy carrying crosses, banners, and reliquaries. The choir sang Gregorian chants, their voices echoing off the high stone ceiling and walls. The solemn beauty of the music contrasted grotesquely with the ugly reality of the decomposing corpse that was the focus of all this ceremony. The officiating cardinal, wearing his most elaborate vestments and struggling in the heat, approached the catafalque to begin the prayers for the dead. He tried to maintain his focus on the liturgy, but his eyes kept being drawn to the corpse and the signs of continuing decomposition that were becoming impossible to ignore. As the cardinal intoned the ancient prayers, attendants moved around the catafalque swinging censers filled with smoking incense. The fragrant smoke was supposed to symbolize prayers rising to heaven, but its more practical purpose was to mask the smell of death. The incense created a thick haze around the body, momentarily obscuring the view and providing some olfactory relief to those nearby. But when the smoke cleared, the corpse remained, more grotesque with each passing minute as the heat continued its relentless work. Those standing closest to the catafalque could hear occasional soft sounds coming from the body, like air slowly escaping from a punctured bladder as gases shifted inside the sealed corpse. The heat continued to build as more people packed into the basilica and the morning sun beat down on the roof. The temperature inside approached levels that would be considered dangerous even for healthy people, and many in attendance were elderly or already weakened by the journey to Rome. Several people fainted and had to be carried out. Others discreetly loosened their clothing or removed outer layers of vestments, trying to cope with the oppressive conditions. But the ceremony could not be shortened or rushed. Tradition demanded that every prayer be spoken, every ritual completed, every symbolic gesture performed. The show of respect for the deceased pope and the demonstration of church continuity had to be perfect, regardless of the physical discomfort involved. As the Mass proceeded through its carefully choreographed stages, those with the best view of the corpse began to notice accelerating changes. The abdomen was visibly swelling, slowly but perceptibly rising higher. The vestments that had been arranged to drape elegantly now stretched taut across the distended torso. The fabric creaked slightly with the pressure. Some of the more observant clergy began shifting uneasily, sensing that something was wrong, but unable to articulate what, or to stop a ceremony that involved hundreds of people and followed a script centuries old. The embalmers, standing at a discreet distance, watched with growing horror, knowing what was likely to happen, but powerless to prevent it. The cardinal conducting the ceremony reached the part of the liturgy where he would approach the body for the final blessing and anointing. According to tradition, he would sprinkle holy water on the corpse, make the sign of the cross, and offer prayers for the Pope's soul. This required standing directly beside the catafalque and leaning over the body. The cardinal hesitated for just a moment, looking at the swollen corpse and the cracks spreading through the wax coating on the face. He could see dark fluid seeping through the vestments in several places. He could hear a low, almost inaudible rumbling sound coming from the body, Every instinct screamed at him to step back, but duty and tradition compelled him forward. The explosion. The cardinal leaned forward, aspergillum in hand, ready to sprinkle holy water on the papal corpse. At that exact moment, several factors that had been building toward catastrophe over the past days converged. The internal pressure from decomposition gases had reached critical levels. The heat had softened the wax sealants and loosened the bindings wrapped around the torso. The embalmer's hasty repairs had created weak points in the wrappings, and the slight vibration from the cardinal's movement as he stepped onto the raised platform of the catafalque provided the final trigger. What happened next occurred in less than a second, but would be remembered in horrified detail by every witness for the rest of their lives. The papal corpse exploded. The abdomen ruptured with a sound like a thunderclap in the enclosed space of the basilica. The explosion was so violent that it lifted the heavy vestments covering the torso and sent a geyser of putrid fluid, liquefied tissue, and decomposition gases erupting upward. The cardinal, who had been leaning directly over the body, took the full force of the eruption directly in his face and chest. He was blown backward by the force, stumbling off the catafalque platform and landing hard on the marble floor, completely covered in the products of decomposition that had been building inside the corpse for days. The explosion sent a spray of material across a radius of several meters. Clergy, standing near the catafalque, were splattered with putrid fluid that had been under pressure inside the corpse. Bits of liquefied tissue and organ matter flew through the air, landing on vestments, faces, and hair of those unlucky enough to be in range. The papal mitre went flying, sailing through the air and landing in the crowd. The fine vestments that had covered the corpse were blown open, revealing the cavity beneath, now partially emptied of the pressure that had built to critical levels. The embalmer's packing materials, soaked in decomposition fluid, scattered like grotesque confetti. The smell that was released was beyond anything the witnesses had experienced during the lying-in state. It was as if the gates of hell had opened, releasing the concentrated essence of death and decay that had been trapped inside the sealed corpse. The smell was not just offensive to the nose, it was a physical assault that triggered immediate and violent reactions in everyone present. People began vomiting instantly, unable to control their body's rejection of the sensory input. The vomiting spread through the crowd like a wave, one person after another losing control. The sounds of retching competed with the screams and shouts of horror and confusion. The cardinal, who had been directly in the path of the explosion, lay on the floor, completely motionless for a moment in shock. When he did move, his first action was to tear at his vestments, trying desperately to remove the soaked fabric from his body. His ornate ceremonial robes, which had been pristine white and gold, were now stained dark brown and black with the products of decomposition. His face, hair, and beard dripped with the fluid that had erupted from the corpse. He opened his mouth to shout or scream, but immediately gagged on the taste of death that coated his tongue and throat. He rolled onto his side and vomited violently, again and again, unable to stop. The bishops and clergy who had been standing nearest to the catafalque fled in panic. All sense of decorum and religious solemnity evaporated in the face of the horror they had witnessed and, worse, experienced. They pushed through the crowd, desperate to escape the basilica and the smell that clung to everything. Some tore at their own vestments as they ran, trying to remove garments that had been contaminated. Others grabbed cloths or parts of their robes to cover their faces, though nothing could block the smell that seemed to penetrate every barrier. The carefully choreographed ceremony dissolved into chaos as hundreds of people tried simultaneously to reach the exits. Those who had been further from the catafalque were initially confused by the sudden eruption of chaos, but the advancing smell soon made the situation clear. The cloud of decomposition gases that had been released from the corpse spread through the basilica, carried by the convection currents from the hundreds of candles and the body heat of the assembled crowd. As the smell reached each section of seating, new waves of panic and nausea swept through the attendees. Elderly bishops who had survived wars and plagues found themselves overcome, collapsing in their seats. Younger clergy supported them and carried them toward the exits, forming a stream of people fleeing the building. The papal corpse itself, partially deflated by the explosion, lay revealed on the catafalque. The blast had opened the torso almost completely, and the packing materials that had been stuffed inside spilled out, soaked in putrid fluid. The body cavity was now partially visible, showing the liquefied remains of organs and the extensive damage that decomposition had wreaked. Those few people who glanced back as they fled the basilica saw a sight that would haunt them forever: the ruined body of the man who had been Christ's representative on earth, reduced to a burst sack of decomposing tissue, surrounded by scattered flowers and still burning candles, a grotesque parody of the solemn funeral that was supposed to be taking place. Outside the basilica, those who had escaped the building collapsed on the steps and in the plaza, gasping for fresh air and continuing to vomit. Many were crying, whether from the physical effects of the stench or the emotional trauma of what they had witnessed was unclear. The cardinal who had taken the direct hit of the explosion was brought out by several attendants, still trying to wipe the decomposition fluid from his face and hair. He was shaking violently, possibly from shock, possibly from the body's rejection of the material that coated him. Attendants brought water and wine, trying to wash him clean, but the smell and sensation had penetrated too deeply to be easily removed. The immediate aftermath. The basilica stood empty, except for the ruined corpse on its catafalque, and a few attendants who had been too shocked to flee. These men stood at a distance, covering their faces with cloths, staring at the disaster that had just occurred. The carefully arranged funeral ceremony, which was supposed to demonstrate the Church's eternal majesty and the solemn transition of papal power, had instead become a nightmare of decomposing flesh and bodily fluids. The symbolism could not have been worse for an institution that depended on appearances and the maintenance of dignity. Something had to be done, and quickly, before word of this disaster spread beyond those who had witnessed it. Senior clergy who had managed to maintain some composure despite the horror began issuing orders. The basilica had to be cleared and sealed immediately. The corpse had to be removed and buried as quickly as possible. Everyone who had been contaminated by the explosion needed to be cleaned and provided with fresh vestments. And most critically, everyone who had witnessed the incident needed to be sworn to absolute secrecy. What had happened was, from the Church's perspective, a catastrophe that could undermine faith and provide ammunition to the Church's enemies. Damage control became the immediate priority, even before dealing with the practical problems of cleanup and burial. The attendants who drew the short straw of having to deal with the corpse approached their task with extreme reluctance. They wrapped cloths soaked in vinegar around their faces, though this provided minimal protection against the smell. Working as quickly as possible while trying not to breathe, they gathered up the remains and what was left of the vestments and wrappings. The body had essentially collapsed in on itself after the explosion released the pressure, making it somewhat easier to handle, but infinitely more grotesque. They wrapped everything in multiple layers of canvas and rope, creating a package that looked nothing like the dignified casket that had been prepared for the papal burial. The original plan had been for the Pope to be buried in a marble sarcophagus within the basilica itself, in a place of honor among his predecessors. This was now impossible. Apart from the practical problems of moving the contaminated remains through the building, there was the political reality that no one would ever want to pray near a tomb associated with such a disaster. A hasty decision was made to bury the remains outside the city, in an unmarked location that would become forgotten over time. Some clergy argued that this was deeply disrespectful to a pope, but the majority agreed that the embarrassment of an anonymous grave was preferable to the ongoing humiliation of having the exploded pope's tomb as a permanent reminder of the disaster. A cart was brought around to a side entrance of the basilica, away from public view. The wrapped remains were loaded onto it quickly, without ceremony or prayer. A small group of clergy and attendants accompanied the cart as it left the city, traveling on back roads to avoid attention. They reached a cemetery on the outskirts of Rome as night was falling, and by torchlight, they dug a grave. There was no marker, no inscription, no indication of who was buried there. The group said quick prayers, more out of habit than genuine spiritual devotion at that point, and filled in the grave. They then dispersed, each man heading to his own quarters, carrying with them the memory of the day's events and strict instructions never to speak of what had happened. Back at the basilica, a different kind of work began. The building had to be cleaned and purified after the contamination it had suffered. Servants brought buckets of water, vinegar, and lye soap. They scrubbed the marble floors where the explosion had scattered its products. They washed down the catafalque and removed the flowers and candles. The vestments and cloths that had been contaminated were gathered up and burned in a fire that sent dark smoke rising into the night sky. The stains on the floor proved difficult to remove completely, and some discoloration remained, despite vigorous scrubbing, a permanent reminder of what had occurred. The cleanup crews discovered that the smell had penetrated into the porous stone of the basilica's walls and floor. No amount of washing could completely remove it. The building would carry the faint scent of decomposition for weeks, perhaps months, despite every cleaning effort. Plans were made to reconsecrate the entire basilica, as if the building itself had been defiled by what had occurred. Priests performed purification rituals, sprinkling holy water and burning enormous amounts of incense, trying to restore the sanctity of the space. Whether these rituals addressed the spiritual contamination was a matter of faith. They certainly did nothing for the lingering smell. The cardinal, who had been the primary victim of the explosion, spent days recovering from the physical and psychological trauma. Servants helped him wash repeatedly, but he claimed he could still smell the death on his skin and taste it in his mouth days later. He went through several sets of vestments, finding the smell on each one and demanding fresh clothing. Eventually, he began to accept that the sensation might be more in his mind than on his body, but the psychological damage remained. He reportedly had nightmares for the rest of his life, dreaming of being crushed under a weight of rotting flesh, drowning in a sea of decomposition. The other witnesses dispersed to their home countries and dioceses, carrying the story with them despite the official prohibition on speaking about it. While they might not share the details openly, they told trusted confidants who told others, and slowly the story spread. Each retelling potentially added embellishments or details that may or may not have been accurate, but the core facts remained. A pope's body had exploded during his own funeral, showering the assembled clergy with the products of his decomposition. It was, depending on one's perspective, either the ultimate humiliation for a religious leader or a stark reminder of the corruption that awaits all human flesh, regardless of earthly rank. The cover-up and consequences. In the days and weeks following the disastrous funeral, the church hierarchy mobilized to contain the story and minimize its impact. Cardinals met in closed sessions to discuss how to handle the situation. Some argued for complete denial, claiming that nothing unusual had happened and that the funeral had proceeded normally. Others suggested a partial admission, acknowledging that there had been difficulties due to the heat and the Pope's illness, but downplaying the extent of the disaster. A third faction believed that the best approach was to say nothing at all and hope that the story would fade from memory over time. In the end, a combination of strategies was employed. Official records of the papal funeral were carefully edited. Descriptions of the ceremony were written in the same formal language used for other papal funerals, with no mention of the explosion or the chaos that followed. The date and location of burial were left intentionally vague in the records, making it difficult for future historians to investigate what had really happened. Some documents that contained more detailed accounts were quietly removed from archives and destroyed. The Church was creating an official version of history that bore little resemblance to what had actually occurred, a practice that was unfortunately common in an era when the Church controlled most written records. The clergy who had witnessed the disaster were reminded of their vows of obedience and their duty to protect the church from scandal. Some were reassigned to distant posts where they would have less opportunity to spread the story. Others were promoted or given special privileges, effectively buying their silence. A few who seemed unable or unwilling to keep quiet about what they had witnessed faced more serious consequences. They might find themselves accused of minor infractions and subjected to ecclesiastical punishment, or transferred to monasteries where they would be isolated from the outside world. The message was clear. The church would protect itself, and those who threatened that protection would be dealt with. Despite these efforts, stories about the incident began circulating. Travelers and merchants who had been in Rome at the time carried rumors back to their home countries. These rumors were often exaggerated or mixed with elements from other papal death stories, creating a confused picture of what had really happened. Some accounts claimed the explosion was divine punishment for the Pope's sins. Others suggested it was the work of demons or witchcraft. The truth was probably more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. A simple reminder that even popes are subject to the same biological processes as any other human. But this rational explanation held less appeal than the various religious and supernatural interpretations. The explosion had practical consequences for how the Church handled papal deaths in the future. Never again would a pope's body be allowed to lie in state for days during hot weather, regardless of tradition. New protocols were developed for rapid burial when necessary, with abbreviated ceremonies that could be completed within hours of death rather than days. The embalmer's techniques were refined, with more attention paid to sealing body cavities and preventing gas buildup. Discreet consultations with physicians led to better understanding of decomposition and how to slow it, though the underlying biological processes would not be truly understood until the development of germ theory centuries later. There were also theological implications that troubled some church scholars. If God protected and sanctified the bodies of saints, as church doctrine held, how could he allow the body of his chief representative on earth to undergo such grotesque decomposition and public humiliation? Some theologians argued that this proved the deceased pope must have been a great sinner who deserved such punishment. Others maintained that the condition of the corpse had no bearing on the state of the soul, and that the physical decomposition was simply natural process. These debates remained largely private, as no one wanted to openly question church doctrine or papal sanctity, but they reflected a deeper discomfort with what the incident revealed about the gap between religious ideals and physical reality. The psychological impact on those who had directly witnessed the explosion was profound and lasting. Several clergy members left religious service within months of the incident, unable to reconcile their faith with what they had experienced. Others became obsessive about cleanliness and purity, developing what we might now recognize as symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder related to contamination fears. Some had recurring nightmares about corpses exploding, or found themselves unable to attend funerals without experiencing panic attacks. The trauma was real and severe, but in an age without modern psychology, these men had to cope on their own or through prayer and spiritual counsel that may not have addressed the actual psychological damage. The incident also affected attitudes toward papal mortality more broadly. The office of the Pope was supposed to represent eternal spiritual authority, but events like this made it impossible to ignore the very mortal and even repulsive nature of the physical body that housed that authority. This tension between the spiritual and physical, between the eternal office and the decaying flesh, became more explicit in papal funerals afterward. There was less emphasis on the physical body and more on symbols of the continuing institution. The Pope as an individual died and decomposed like anyone else, but the papacy itself was eternal and untouched by such earthly concerns. This shift in emphasis was a direct result of the disaster of the exploding corpse. Medical understanding in hindsight. From a modern medical perspective, what happened to the unfortunate Pope was a predictable consequence of aggressive bacterial infection, decomposition, and poor preservation techniques. The necrotizing fasciitis that likely caused his pre-death decay is a severe infection that destroys soft tissue rapidly. The bacteria involved, typically Streptococcus pyogenes or Clostridium species, produce toxins and enzymes that break down skin, muscle, and connective tissue. The infection spreads along fascial planes, the sheets of tissue that separate muscles, allowing it to advance through the body at alarming speed, sometimes progressing several inches per hour in severe cases. Gas gangrene, which was almost certainly present in the Pope's case, occurs when Clostridium bacteria, particularly Clostridium perfringens, infect dead or dying tissue. These bacteria are anaerobic, meaning they thrive in environments without oxygen, such as deep wounds or dead tissue. As they metabolize tissue, they produce large amounts of gas, primarily hydrogen and carbon dioxide. This gas becomes trapped in tissue spaces, causing the characteristic swelling and crepitus, the crackling sensation felt when the affected area is pressed. The gas also puts pressure on blood vessels, cutting off circulation to surrounding tissue and allowing the infection to spread even faster in a vicious cycle of tissue death and bacterial growth. The smell associated with these infections comes from various chemical compounds produced by bacterial metabolism. As bacteria break down proteins, they release sulfur compounds like hydrogen sulfide and mercaptans, which smell like rotten eggs and sewage. The breakdown of fats produces fatty acids that have a rancid smell. Putrescine and cadaverine, chemical compounds with names that literally mean corpse smell, are produced as amino acids decompose. These compounds are remarkably persistent and can bind to other materials, making it nearly impossible to completely remove the smell once it has contaminated clothing, hair, or porous surfaces like stone. The explosion itself was caused by pressure buildup from decomposition gases. After death, bacteria in the intestines and those from the existing infection continued to break down tissue, producing gas at an accelerating rate as the bacterial population multiplied. In a modern embalming, this pressure would be relieved through proper drainage and the use of preservative chemicals that kill bacteria. The medieval embalmer's technique of removing organs and packing the cavity with herbs and salt was actually sound in principle but inadequate in practice. The infection had spread throughout the body, meaning bacteria were present in all tissues, not just the organs that were removed. The packing materials absorbed some fluid, but did nothing to stop bacterial activity. The heat was the critical accelerating factor. Bacterial metabolism increases with temperature, roughly doubling in rate for every 10 degrees Celsius increase within the bacteria's viable range. The hot Roman summer day, combined with the heat from hundreds of candles and the body heat from a crowded basilica, created optimal conditions for rapid bacterial growth and gas production. The internal temperature of the corpse likely rose significantly above ambient temperature as the bacteria generated their own heat through metabolic activity. This created a feedback loop. Heat increased bacterial activity, which produced more heat, which further increased bacterial activity until the pressure became unsustainable. The wax coating and multiple layers of wrapping that the embalmers applied, intended to preserve the body and control the smell, actually made the situation worse. These coverings created a sealed environment that trapped gases inside the body cavity. If the corpse had been left more exposed, gases could have escaped gradually through various openings, preventing dangerous pressure buildup. Instead, the seals forced pressure to accumulate until it exceeded the structural strength of the tissue and wrappings. The explosion was essentially the same phenomenon that occurs when a sealed container is heated. Pressure builds until something gives way catastrophically. Modern forensic science can explain exactly what happened during the explosion itself. The weakest point in the sealed corpse was likely where the embalmers had made their incision to remove organs. This area had been stitched closed, but was fundamentally weaker than intact tissue. When the internal pressure reached a critical threshold, the tissue at this weak point tore open. The gas under pressure rushed out, carrying with it fluid and liquefied tissue in a spray pattern that physics can accurately predict based on the pressure differential and the size of the opening. The sound would have been produced by the sudden release of pressurized gas, similar to popping a balloon, but with the added wet, tearing sound of tissue rupturing. The medical literature contains numerous cases of corpses releasing gases or fluids during handling, though explosions of the magnitude that occurred at the papal funeral are relatively rare. Forensic pathologists and funeral home workers are trained to recognize the signs of gas buildup and to take precautions. Modern embalming techniques include trocar aspiration, where a long needle is inserted into body cavities to draw out fluids and gases specifically to prevent the kind of pressure buildup that caused the papal disaster. In cases where bodies are badly decomposed or have been dead for extended periods, special handling procedures are followed to minimize the risk of sudden releases of gas or fluid during movement or preparation. The health risks to those who were splattered with decomposition fluid were significant, though the medieval witnesses would not have understood the specific mechanisms. The fluid contained billions of bacteria, many of which could potentially cause infection if they entered the body through cuts, eyes, nose, or mouth. The intense immune response that causes immediate vomiting when exposed to such material is actually a protective mechanism, the body's attempt to expel potentially dangerous pathogens. Those who were directly contaminated would have been at risk for developing secondary infections, and in an age without antibiotics, such infections could be fatal. It's likely that some witnesses did suffer health consequences beyond the psychological trauma. Though without detailed records, we cannot know how many or how severely they were affected. Similar incidents in history. The papal explosion, while extreme, was not entirely unique in the annals of funeral disasters and decomposition horror stories. Throughout medieval and early modern history, there were other incidents where inadequate preservation techniques, hot weather, and delayed burial created catastrophic results. These incidents were rarely recorded in detail, as they were embarrassing to the families and institutions involved, but enough evidence survives to show that the problem was more common than most people realize. The human body's decay after death is an inevitable process, and attempts to delay burial while maintaining appearances frequently led to unpleasant or even dangerous situations. One well-documented case involved King Henry VIII of England. When he died in 1547, his massive body, which had become obese in his later years, was sealed in a lead coffin and left overnight in the chapel at Sion Abbey during the journey to Windsor for burial. According to witnesses, by morning the coffin had leaked, and there were stains on the floor beneath it. Some accounts claim that dogs were found licking the leaked fluids, a grotesque detail that may have been invented by Henry's enemies, but reflects the real problems that occurred when trying to transport and preserve bodies over long distances in warm weather. The lead coffin, while preventing smell from escaping, had done nothing to stop decomposition inside. King Louis XIV of France presented a different but related problem when he died in 1715 after an agonizing bout of gangrene in his leg. Like the Pope in our main story, he suffered from tissue death and infection before his actual demise. The embalming of his body was reportedly so difficult that the embalmers became ill from the process. When his body lay in state, guards had to be stationed not just for security, but to prevent people from fleeing due to the smell. The elaborate funeral ceremony had to be somewhat abbreviated because the decomposition was progressing despite preservation attempts. His body was eventually buried, but when his tomb was opened during the French Revolution, his body was found to be in an advanced state of decay, more so than other bodies of similar age in nearby tombs, suggesting the initial infection had left bacteria throughout his tissues. A particularly disturbing incident occurred during the funeral of Pope Alexander VI in 1503. Though not involving an explosion, it demonstrated similar problems with decomposition and preservation. Alexander VI died suddenly during an exceptionally hot Roman summer, possibly from poisoning, though malaria and other natural causes are also suspected. His body swelled grotesquely within hours, turning black and beginning to emit a terrible smell. The embalmers struggled to fit the bloated corpse into the coffin, reportedly having to jump on it to compress the body enough to close the lid. During the funeral vigil, the corpse continued to swell and began leaking through the coffin. Guards abandoned their posts due to the smell, and the body had to be buried hastily with minimal ceremony, a humiliating end for a pope who had been one of the most powerful men in Europe. The case of Eleanor of Castile, wife of King Edward I of England, demonstrates the problems that arose when important figures died far from their intended burial place. She died in 1290 in Lincolnshire, but needed to be transported to Westminster Abbey in London, a journey of several days. Her body was eviscerated and the organs buried locally, a common practice called division of the corpse that was intended to make transportation of royal bodies more practical. However, even with organs removed, her body began to decompose during the journey. At each stopping point, Edward ordered the construction of an Eleanor Cross monument, ultimately creating 12 crosses that marked the funeral procession route. Some historians suggest these crosses were as much about marking places where the smell became overwhelming and stops were necessary as they were about memorializing his wife. Non-royal figures faced even worse situations when decomposition outpaced burial preparations. In medieval cities, particularly during summer, deaths could occur in the morning with visible decomposition by afternoon. Poor families who couldn't afford rapid burial sometimes had to watch their loved ones decay in their homes for days while saving money for funeral expenses. The smell would permeate the building and neighborhood. There are accounts of neighbors forcing families to bury their dead or face being barred from the community. These situations occurred so regularly that they were almost unremarkable, but they created ongoing public health issues in crowded urban areas. The plague years of the 14th century saw decomposition issues on a massive scale that make individual funeral disasters pale by comparison. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried, often lying in homes or streets for days before collection. In hot weather, the decomposition created unbearable conditions. There are accounts of bodies swelling and rupturing, of carts transporting corpses leaving trails of fluids, of burial pits that had to be sealed because the decomposition gases and fluids were leaching into the surrounding soil and water supply. The trauma of the plague years included not just the death toll, but the assault on the senses and dignity that came with the inability to properly handle all the dead. Military history is filled with similar incidents on battlefields, where decomposition created hazards for survivors. After major battles in hot weather, bodies would begin swelling and rupturing within hours. Soldiers assigned to burial details frequently became ill from exposure to decomposition products. Some battlefield commanders learned to burn bodies rather than bury them when dealing with large numbers of casualties in warm weather, as this was faster and created fewer ongoing health hazards. Though religious objections to cremation often prevented this solution, the smell of decomposing human remains would linger over battlefields for weeks, making the areas nearly uninhabitable. Modern funeral industry standards developed largely as a response to these historical disasters. The formalization of embalming techniques, the legal requirements for rapid burial or refrigeration, and the professional standards that funeral directors must meet all exist because of past incidents where inadequate handling of bodies created public health hazards or traumatic experiences for mourners. The papal explosion and similar historical incidents, while horrifying, ultimately led to better practices that spare most people from witnessing the more grotesque aspects of decomposition. However, It's worth noting that these safeguards can still fail, particularly in disaster situations, mass casualty events, or places without developed funeral industries, meaning similar horrors still occasionally occur in the modern world. In the end, the Pope who exploded during his funeral joins a long list of historical figures whose deaths or post-mortem fates are remembered more vividly than their lives. He may have been a skilled politician, a learned theologian, or a compassionate spiritual leader. We don't know, and history hasn't preserved those details. But his body's rebellion against the dignity demanded of it, the spectacular and disgusting failure of the funeral ceremony, this has been preserved in memory and story. It's not the legacy anyone would want, but it's a powerful one nonetheless, a reminder carved into human memory by the intensity of its horror that no earthly power can override the fundamental processes of nature. The basilica where it occurred was eventually purified and returned to regular use, though some claimed it never quite smelled right again. The grave where the remains were buried became forgotten over time, its exact location lost to history. The witnesses died one by one, taking their direct memories with them, though the story they told persisted. And the church continued, as institutions do, absorbing the incident into its long and complex history, learning from it in practical ways while denying it officially. The explosion itself lasted only a second, a sudden rupture and release, but its echo has carried across centuries, a grotesque note in the grand symphony of human history that reminds us of our essential nature. We are mortal, we decay, and all the ceremony in the world cannot change these simple facts.